The Great Pyramid of Giza was built from roughly 2.3 million stone blocks, some weighing as much as 80 tons, stacked with a precision that keeps its base level to within about 2 centimeters across more than 13 acres. And after nearly 200 years of serious archaeological study, no one has ever found a single ancient document describing exactly how it was actually built. That's just the first of 250 facts tonight about a civilization that lasted longer than the gap between itself and us, and that still keeps more secrets than almost any other era of the ancient world. We'll walk through the Sphinx's disputed age, the mummification chemistry only recently reverse-engineered from residue in 4,000-year-old jars, a labyrinth larger than any pyramid that has essentially vanished from the earth, and the queen whose face is one of the most famous in history, while her actual body has never been found. Some of tonight's mysteries have careful, evidence-based answers. A genuine number of them still don't. Let the sand settle and let Egypt carry you slowly toward sleep. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built as a tomb for the pharaoh Khufu, who reigned during Egypt's 4th dynasty, beginning around 2589 BCE, remains the only one of the ancient world's 7 wonders still substantially standing today. And despite standing in plain sight for more than 4,500 years, the precise construction method used to raise its 2.3 million blocks, some weighing as little as 2.5 tons and others reaching 80 tons or more for the granite blocks used in the king's chamber, remains only partially resolved among working Egyptologists. The pyramid's builder is known with reasonable confidence, since the vizier Himiunu, believed by most Egyptologists to have served as the project's chief architect, is depicted in his own tomb inscriptions near Giza, holding the title Overseer of all the King's Works, and a statue of Himiunu, discovered in 1912 by German archaeologist Hermann Juncker, remains one of the closest things Egyptology has to a named individual directly connected to the pyramid's design. What Hemiunu's own records never explain, because no surviving Egyptian document from any period describes it in technical detail, is precisely how his workforce moved and raised stones this heavy to a final height of 146.6 meters, a height unmatched by any human structure on Earth for the following 3,800 years, until England's Lincoln Cathedral surpassed it in the 14th century. The leading and most widely accepted explanation involves some form of ramp system, since ropes, sledges, and human labor are well documented in surviving Egyptian art depicting the transport of smaller monuments, but archaeologists remain genuinely divided over the ramp's specific design. A straight ramp extending directly from the ground to the pyramid's peak, the simplest option, would need to have stretched more than a mile at a workable incline, requiring more material to build than the pyramid itself, a volume problem serious enough that most modern Egyptologists consider a single straight ramp implausible. Alternative theories include a spiral ramp wrapping around the pyramid's exterior as it rose, and a more recent proposal, published in 2018 by French architect Jean-Pierre Houdin, suggesting an internal spiral ramp built into the pyramid's own structure, a hypothesis partially supported by muon tomography scans conducted by the International Scan Pyramids Project, though no single theory has yet achieved the kind of unanimous, physically confirmed consensus that would close the question definitively. The pyramid's precision only deepens the puzzle rather than resolving it. Surveys conducted using modern laser instruments have confirmed the pyramid's base is level to within roughly 2.1 centimeters across its entire 230-meter footprint, and its 4 sides are oriented to true north with an average error of only about 3 arc-minutes, a level of astronomical accuracy. Some researchers have proposed was achieved using simultaneous transit observations of 2 stars near the celestial pole, a technique described in a widely cited 2000 paper by astronomer Kate Spence, though the theory remains one of several competing explanations rather than a settled fact, since Egyptian records never directly describe the specific surveying method used. That precision is exactly what the scan pyramids project. An international research collaboration using cosmic ray muon detectors was specifically formed to investigate more directly, and in 2017, the team announced the discovery of a previously unknown void, at least 30 meters long, situated directly above the Grand Gallery, a finding published in the journal Nature and independently confirmed using 3 separate detection technologies. The void's exact function, whether it represents a deliberate architectural chamber, a construction gap intended to relieve structural weight from the chambers below, or something else entirely, remains formally unresolved, since no physical access to the space has been attempted as of the most recent published project updates, leaving one of the pyramid's largest confirmed internal features a genuine, still open mystery more than 4,500 years after the structure was completed. A separate and genuinely unresolved puzzle involves 2 narrow shafts extending from the pyramid's so-called Queen's Chamber, first investigated with a small robotic crawler in 1993 by German engineer Rudolf Gantenbrink, whose camera discovered a small limestone door, complete with 2 copper handles blocking the shaft roughly 65 meters in. A follow-up National Geographic-sponsored expedition in 2002 drilled through the first door, only to find a second, nearly identical door, a short distance beyond it, and a considerably more advanced robotic probe sent in 2011 found the second door itself carved with faint red markings, but stopped short of drilling through it entirely, meaning what, if anything, lies beyond these 2 sealed doors remains completely unknown, an active mystery inside one of the most thoroughly studied buildings on the planet. The workforce responsible for actually building the pyramid was, contrary to a popular misconception with no supporting archaeological evidence, not composed of enslaved foreign laborers, a myth researchers have traced back partly to ancient Greek historian Herodotus, writing more than 2,000 years after the pyramid's construction. Excavations conducted since the 1990s by archaeologist Mark Lehner and colleagues at a purpose-built workers' village just south of the Giza Plateau uncovered bakeries, breweries, and worker cemeteries containing skeletal evidence of healed bone fractures, indicating injured laborers received medical care rather than being discarded, alongside inscriptions suggesting a rotating labor system organized around named work gangs with titles like Friends of Khufu, evidence pointing toward a paid or conscripted domestic workforce rather than a slave population, though the precise total number of workers involved, estimates ranging from Herodotus's original claim of 100,000 down to modern archaeological estimates, closer to 20,000 to 30,000 at any given time, remains genuinely debated. Before we go on, if slow walks through ancient mysteries like this one help you drift off, this channel builds a new one on a regular schedule, and subscribing costs nothing beyond making sure the next one finds you. Now, back to the stones themselves. Standing beside the Great Pyramid's eastern face are 3 considerably smaller satellite pyramids, generally identified as the burial monuments of Khufu's principal wives, including his mother, Hetepheres. I discussed later in tonight's video, though the specific assignment of which queen occupied which of the 3 structures has never been fully confirmed through inscription, since all 3 were found stripped of their original identifying grave goods long before modern excavation began. A 4th, still smaller structure, nearby, sometimes called the subsidiary or cult pyramid, appears to have served a purely symbolic ritual function connected to Khufu's own funerary cult, rather than housing any actual burial. At all, a category of small, non-funerary satellite pyramid found accompanying nearly every major Old Kingdom pyramid complex, whose precise theological purpose, beyond the general assumption that it represented some component of the pharaoh's spiritual duality, remains only broadly, rather than precisely understood, since no surviving religious text explains the specific ritual role these small subsidiary structures were built to serve. The only inscription found anywhere inside the Great Pyramid that directly names Khufu himself sits inside a series of narrow, low-ceiling spaces called the relieving chambers, stacked directly above the king's chamber, and discovered in 1800 officer and explorer Richard William Howard Vyse, who used gunpowder to blast his way through solid masonry in search of additional hidden rooms. Vyse workers found rough quarry marks and cartouches painted in red ochre paint on the chamber walls, including the name Khufu, written multiple times, evidence generally accepted by mainstream Egyptologists as genuine ancient workman's graffiti left during construction, since the paint and lettering style are consistent with confirmed Old Kingdom quarry markings found elsewhere. A small minority of researchers outside mainstream Egyptology have over the decades questioned the marks' authenticity, suggesting Vyse himself may have forged them to settle debate over the pyramid's builder once and for all, a claim that has never been substantiated by any physical or documentary evidence, and that the overwhelming consensus of Egyptologists studying the marks directly has rejected, though the accusation itself remains a genuinely persistent thread in popular discussion of the pyramid's history. A separate and genuinely remarkable discovery came in 1954, when Egyptian archaeologist Kamal el-Malak, clearing debris along the pyramid's southern base, uncovered a sealed pit containing 1,024 individual pieces of cedar wood, painstakingly disassembled and packed away more than 4,500 years earlier. Restoration specialist Ahmed Yusuf Mustafa spent more than a decade reconstructing the pieces into a complete 43-meter wooden vessel, now known as the Khufu ship, one of the oldest, largest, and best-preserved wooden boats to survive from antiquity anywhere in the world. Whether the vessel was ever actually used to carry Khufu's body along the Nile as part of his funeral procession was built purely as a symbolic solar bark intended to carry the pharaoh's spirit across the sky in the company of the sun god Ra, or served some combination of both practical and religious purposes, remains genuinely unresolved among Egyptologists, since the ship shows no definitive wear marks that would confirm actual use on water, leaving its precise original function a matter of informed interpretation rather than settled fact. The Great Pyramid's original outer surface looked genuinely nothing like the stepped, exposed block structure visible today, since the entire exterior was once covered in a smooth casing of finely polished white Tura limestone, quarried from a separate site across the Nile and fitted with joints so precise that surviving fragments show gaps measured in fractions of a millimeter. A Finnish contemporary accounts describe as blindingly bright and visible from great distances under direct sunlight. The overwhelming majority of this casing stone was systematically removed following a massive earthquake that struck Cairo in 1303 CE, loosening much of the outer layer, after which successive Mamluk-era rulers, including Sultan an-Nasir Nasir ad-Din al-Hassan, authorized the stripped casing stone's reuse in construction projects throughout medieval Cairo, including several of the city's most prominent mosques, meaning a considerable portion of the Great Pyramid's original polished surface survives today, repurposed and largely unrecognized, embedded within buildings still standing in modern Cairo rather than on the pyramid itself, with only a small band of original casing stones remaining intact near the pyramid's base, and a partial cap of casing preserved at the summit of the nearby, slightly smaller pyramid of Khafre. The workers responsible for constructing and later maintaining Egypt's royal tombs left behind a genuinely unique window into their own daily grievances at the purpose-built village of Deir el-Medina, home to the specialized artisans who worked in the Valley of the Kings during the New Kingdom, where archaeologists have recovered thousands of informal notes called ostraka, written on broken pottery shards and covering everything from personal letters to legal disputes to In one particularly well-documented case, dated to around 1157 BCE, during the reign of Ramesses III, what Egyptologists generally consider history's earliest recorded labor strike. Surviving records describe the workers, angered by significant delays in receiving their standard grain wages, laying down their tools and marching to a nearby mortuary temple to formally register their complaint. With local officials, a protest documented across several papyri, now held primarily in Turin's Egyptian Museum, describing multiple repeated work stoppages over several months before the underlying payment issues were eventually resolved. What remains only partially clear from the surviving fragmentary records is the precise underlying cause of the payment delays themselves, whether administrative failure, genuine grain shortage, or corruption further up the supply chain, leaving the specific breakdown behind one of history's earliest documented labor actions, only partially reconstructed more than 3,000 years later. Carved directly from a single massive outcrop of limestone bedrock near the Giza pyramids, the Great Sphinx stands 73 meters long and 20 meters tall, making it the largest monolithic statue surviving from the ancient world, and despite its scale and fame, Egyptologists still cannot say with total certainty exactly when it was carved, who specifically ordered it built, or whose face it was originally meant to represent. The mainstream archaeological consensus, based on stylistic comparison and the Sphinx's physical proximity to the pyramid complex of the pharaoh Khafre, dates the monument to roughly 2500 BCE, attributing it to Khafre's reign and identifying the Sphinx's face as a representation of Khafre himself, a conclusion supported by the discovery of a diorite statue of Khafre found nearby bearing facial similarities. This dating has never been unanimously accepted, and geologist Robert Schoch proposed, in research first published in 1991, that the deep vertical fissures and rounded erosion patterns visible on the Sphinx's enclosure walls were caused by prolonged, heavy rainfall, a weathering pattern. Schoch argued would require the Sphinx to be considerably older, potentially dating back to before 5000 BCE, when the region's climate was known to be wetter. Schoch's water erosion hypothesis has been directly and repeatedly challenged by the large majority of mainstream Egyptologists and geologists, who argue the erosion pattern is more consistent with wind and sand abrasion, combined with the specific way certain limestone layers absorb and release humidity, and no consensus redating has occurred within the field, leaving Schoch's proposal a genuinely disputed minority position rather than an accepted revision, though it remains one of the more persistently discussed open questions connected to the monument. The Sphinx's missing nose is frequently attributed, in popular retellings, to cannon fire from Napoleon Bonaparte's troops during his 1798 Egyptian campaign, a claim that direct historical evidence contradicts. A sketch of the Sphinx made in 1737 by Danish explorer Frederick Louis Norden, more than 60 years before Napoleon ever set foot in Egypt, already shows the nose missing, and the most widely cited explanation among historians points instead to a 15th century account by Egyptian historian al-Makrizi, who described a Sufi named Muhammad Sa'im al-Dar deliberately vandalizing the statue's face in 1378 as an act of religious iconoclasm, though even this account was written more than a century after the alleged event and lacks fully independent corroboration, leaving the nose's exact fate a matter of historical probability rather than absolute documented certainty. Directly between the Sphinx's paws sits the dream stele, a large granite slab erected around 1401 BCE by the pharaoh Thutmose IV, inscribed with an account claiming the young prince, while resting near the then partially sand-buried Sphinx during a hunting trip, experienced a dream in which the Sphinx itself spoke to him, promising him the throne of Egypt in exchange for clearing the sand that had buried its body up to the neck. Thutmose IV did go on to become pharaoh, and the Steles text has become one of Egyptology's most frequently cited pieces of evidence that the Sphinx was already ancient and partially buried well before the New Kingdom period, its true age already a source of uncertainty and reverence to the Egyptians themselves more than 1,000 years before Cleopatra's own era, a detail worth sitting with, that even ancient Egyptians looked back on the Sphinx the way modern visitors do now, as a genuinely old and only partially understood monument from an earlier age. The dream stele carries a further layer of interest beyond its religious content, since Thutmose IV was, by most reconstructions of 18th dynasty royal succession, not his father's first-choice heir, with several Egyptologists proposing an elder brother may have originally held that position before dying or otherwise falling out of the succession, under circumstances no surviving record clearly explains. Viewed against this backdrop, a considerable number of historians studying the dream stele's specific wording and prominent public placement have proposed the entire inscription may have functioned, at least in part, as a deliberate piece of political propaganda, a divinely sanctioned origin, story commissioned specifically to reinforce Thutmose IV's legitimacy as pharaoh after what may have been a genuinely irregular path to the throne, rather than existing purely as an act of religious devotion. This interpretation remains a matter of scholarly inference rather than direct confirmation, since no surviving Egyptian source explicitly states the stele was commissioned for this specific political purpose, leaving historians to reconstruct the likely motive from context and comparison with how other Egyptian pharaohs are known to have used religious monuments to reinforce contested claims to power throughout Egyptian history. Excavations of the Sphinx Temple and the adjacent Valley Temple, both constructed from massive limestone blocks quarried directly from the trench dug to free the Sphinx's body, have revealed a construction technique using core blocks weighing up to 200 tons each, later cased in finer Tura limestone and red granite, a scale of stonework that closely matches the technical sophistication seen at Khafre's pyramid complex, evidence generally cited in support of the mainstream dating, even as the temple's own original purpose, whether primarily solar, funerary, or some combination researchers still debate, remains without a single fully agreed-upon interpretation among specialists studying the site. Traces of the Sphinx's original coloring, faint but genuinely detectable red pigment remnants surviving in protected crevices of the face and body, confirmed through direct examination by multiple archaeological teams over the past century, indicate the monument was likely painted in vivid color when first completed, a detail consistent with the broader ancient Egyptian practice of painting virtually all monumental stone sculpture rather than leaving it in bare limestone, a practice modern popular imagination, shaped by millennia of that same paint weathering away entirely, rarely pictures accurately. Whether the Sphinx's body was painted a single uniform color or featured the more elaborate multicolor detailing confirmed on smaller, better-preserved statues from the same general period remains impossible to determine with confidence, since so little pigment survives across the monument's weathered surface. The Sphinx's identity has itself never achieved full unanimous agreement even among Egyptologists who accept the mainstream 4th dynasty dating. Egyptian archaeologist Selim Hassan, who conducted extensive excavations around the Sphinx enclosure during the 1930s and cleared away centuries of accumulated sand to expose the monument's full body for the first time, in the modern era, argued the statue may have originally been commissioned by Khafre's father, Khufu, rather than Khafre himself, based on the specific layout and orientation of the surrounding causeway complex, an alternative attribution that has never displaced the Khafre identification as the field's leading hypothesis, but that continues to be cited by a meaningful minority of researchers as a genuinely open possibility rather than a fully closed question. Adding a further layer of physical mystery, A carved stone fragment matching the style of a pharaoh's ceremonial false beard, evidently once attached to the Sphinx's chin, was recovered from the surrounding sand and is now held in the British Museum, though analysis of the fragment's carving style suggests it was likely added considerably later than the Sphinx's original construction, possibly during a New Kingdom restoration effort, meaning even the beard familiar from countless modern illustrations may never have been part of the monument's earliest appearance at all. Persistent rumors, circulating periodically since at least the early 20th century, claim a second, smaller Sphinx-like statue remains buried somewhere near the Giza Plateau, a story that appears to trace back largely to unverified early excavation reports and has never been supported by any confirmed geophysical survey or excavation conducted at the site, and the overwhelming consensus among Egyptologists who have directly investigated the claim treats it as an enduring piece of archaeological folklore rather than a genuine open research question. A useful reminder that not every persistent rumor connected to Giza rises to the level of an actual unresolved scholarly mystery, even within a chapter otherwise dedicated to genuine ones. A genuinely confirmed astronomical alignment, by contrast, involves the specific vantage point of the Sphinx itself, since observers standing directly behind the monument on the spring or autumn equinox can watch the sun set precisely between the pyramids of Khafre and Menkaure on the horizon beyond, an alignment repeatedly documented through modern photography and surveying since the late 20th century. Whether this equinox alignment was a deliberate feature of the original Giza Plateau's overall design, reflecting genuine ancient astronomical planning, connecting the Sphinx and the pyramid complex as a single coordinated religious statement, or whether it represents a coincidental byproduct of decisions made primarily for other structural and geographic reasons, remains a genuinely open question among Egyptologists, since no surviving Egyptian text explicitly describes the Giza Plateau's layout as having been planned around this specific solar event, leaving researchers to weigh the alignment's precision against the broader absence of any direct textual confirmation that it was intentional. Egyptian mummification, practiced in some form for more than 3,000 years, from roughly 3,500 BCE through the Roman period, was never a static or fully standardized process, and modern chemical analysis of preserved remains has only recently begun to reveal just how sophisticated, and in several respects still only partially understood, the actual embalming techniques were. The most detailed surviving ancient account of the mummification process comes not from an Egyptian source, but from the Greek historian Herodotus, writing around 450 BCE, who described the 70-day embalming process, the removal of internal organs, and the use of natron, a naturally occurring salt-salt mixture harvested from dry lake beds in Egypt's Wadi Natron region, to desiccate the body. Herodotus's account, while broadly consistent with what modern archaeology has confirmed, was written more than 2,000 years after mummification practices first began, and no equivalent detailed technical manual written by Egyptian embalmers themselves has ever been discovered, meaning much of what modern researchers understand about specific embalming recipes has had to be reconstructed indirectly through chemical residue analysis rather than any surviving how-to text from the practitioners. A landmark 2018 study led by archaeological chemist Stephen Buckley and Egyptologist Joanne Fletcher, analyzing residue from mummification equipment found at a burial site in Saqqara, dating to roughly 2,200 to 2,500 BCE, used gas chromatography and mass spectrometry to identify a complex embalming recipe combining plant oils, aromatic tree resins including juniper and cedar, beeswax, and a specific antibacterial compound. Evidence the Egyptians had developed a genuinely sophisticated understanding of which specific substances would slow bodily decomposition centuries before germ theory existed in any form. Buckley and Fletcher's analysis found that the earliest confirmed embalming recipes, dating back further than previously assumed, were already remarkably close in composition to formulas used more than 1,000 years later, suggesting the core chemistry was established early and remained stable, though precisely how Egyptian embalmers first identified which specific tree resins and oils would work best through what must have been extensive practical trial and error remains entirely undocumented in the surviving historical record. The removal of the brain during mummification, achieved by inserting a long hooked instrument through the nostril to break through the thin ethmoid bone and manually extract brain tissue in fragments, a technique confirmed through CT scans of numerous mummies, including a detailed 2021 digital study of Pharaoh Amenhotep I, led by radiologist Sahar Salim, presents a genuine puzzle precisely because the brain was typically discarded rather than preserved, while the heart, considered the seat of intelligence and emotion in Egyptian belief, was carefully left in place or ritually returned to the body. This deliberate discarding of what modern science recognizes as the organ actually responsible for thought and memory, paired with the ritual preservation of an organ we now know, serves neither function, illustrates how differently ancient Egyptian anatomical understanding was organized compared to the modern framework, a genuine conceptual gap rather than simply an error, since Egyptian embalming was built around a coherent belief system regarding the body's afterlife needs that operated on entirely different assumptions about which organs mattered and why. Canopic jars, the 4 vessels used to separately store the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines removed during mummification, were each traditionally associated with one of the 4 sons of the god Horus and protected by a corresponding goddess, a symbolic system that remained remarkably consistent across roughly 2,000 years of Egyptian religious practice, even as the jar's physical form evolved considerably, from plain stone containers in the Old Kingdom to the elaborate animal-headed lids, jackal, baboon, falcon, and human, familiar from later periods. What remains only partially explained is the specific theological reasoning behind exactly why these 4 organs, rather than others, were selected for this particular ritual treatment, since surviving religious texts describe the practice's symbolic importance without ever fully explaining its original conceptual origin. A separate and genuinely striking scientific finding involves the Fayum mummy portraits, remarkably lifelike painted panels produced during Egypt's Roman period, roughly the 1st through 3rd centuries CE, attached directly over the faces of mummified individuals and painted using an encaustic technique involving pigmented beeswax, a method that has preserved the portrait's vivid color for nearly 2,000 years, with a realism that startles most people encountering the images for the first time. Modern pigment analysis conducted on several surviving Fayum portraits has identified genuinely rare and expensive materials, including Egyptian blue, one of the first synthetic pigments ever manufactured, and researchers studying the portrait's brushwork have concluded they were likely painted from life or from a recent posthumous sitting rather than from generic templates, based on the individualized asymmetries and specific aging details visible in different subjects, though which specific workshops produced them, and how widely the practice was distributed beyond the small number of sites where the portraits have actually been recovered remains only partially mapped archaeologically. Deliberate mummification itself appears to have developed gradually out of an entirely accidental earlier discovery, since Egypt's dynastic period, well before 3500 BCE, saw bodies buried directly in shallow pits dug into the hot, dry desert sand, a practice that, entirely without embalmers or ritual intervention, naturally desiccated and preserved soft tissue remarkably well through simple dehydration alone. A 2014 study led by researcher Jana Jones, analyzing linen wrappings from predynastic burials held in the Bolton Museum in England using gas chromatography, identified resin and plant oil residues on burial wrappings dating to as early as 4300 BCE, more than 7 centuries before deliberate mummification, is traditionally believed to have begun, suggesting Egyptians were already experimenting with embalming substances considerably earlier than previously assumed, potentially inspired by the observed preservation of these early, entirely natural sand burials, precisely when Egyptians transitioned from simple, unintentional sand preservation toward the fully deliberate, technically sophisticated embalming practices, confirmed later in the Old Kingdom, remains only partially documented, since the intervening centuries of gradual experimentation left behind a scattered and incomplete archaeological record rather than any clear, continuous developmental sequence. A considerable portion of what might otherwise have survived for modern chemical analysis was instead lost during the 19th century, when Egyptian mummies, imported to Britain and elsewhere in large numbers following Napoleon's campaign and the wave of European fascination with Egypt it triggered, became the centerpiece of a genuinely startling form of Victorian entertainment, the public mummy unwrapping party, in which a wealthy host would invite guests to watch, and sometimes participate directly in, the live unwrapping of a purchased mummy in a private drawing room, treating the destruction of a genuine ancient burial as an evening's fashionable amusement. Surgeon Thomas Pettigrew, who conducted dozens of these unwrapping events during the 1830s, including some performed before paying audiences at London's Egyptian Hall, did keep more careful anatomical notes than most of his contemporaries, giving his specific sessions genuine, if ethically troubling, scientific value. But the overwhelming majority of unwrapping parties conducted across Britain and Europe during this period left no scholarly record at all, meaning an unknown but likely substantial number of ancient Egyptian mummies, and whatever embalming evidence and personal artifacts had survived with them for thousands of years were destroyed for casual entertainment and left completely undocumented, a genuine and irreversible loss to modern archaeological science that no later chemical analysis technique can ever recover. A genuinely counterintuitive pattern emerges when researchers compare mummification quality across different periods of Egyptian history, since the practice's outward elaborateness and its actual technical effectiveness at preserving the body did not always move together. CT scans of numerous Ptolemaic and Roman period mummies, conducted across several published studies since the 1990s, have repeatedly found that many burials from this later era, despite featuring increasingly ornate outer wrappings, elaborate geometric bandaging patterns, and expensive painted portrait panels like the Fayum examples discussed earlier in this chapter, actually preserved the underlying body considerably less effectively than mummies from 1,000 years earlier, with some later examples showing internal organs left partially in place and decomposing, or bodies packed with mud, sand, or broken pottery fragments rather than the careful natron desiccation process described by Herodotus, apparently to maintain a convincingly full and lifelike outer shape despite reduced internal preservation effort. Egyptologists studying this decline generally attribute it to mummification becoming an increasingly commercialized, tiered industry under Greek and later Roman rule, with wealthy clients still able to commission genuinely careful, technically excellent embalming, while a growing middle-class market apparently prioritized an impressive external appearance over the costlier, more labor-intensive internal preservation techniques that had defined the practice at its technical peak centuries earlier, a genuine trade-off in priorities that modern imaging technology has only been able to fully expose in the past few decades, since the elaborate outer wrappings themselves gave no external indication of what compromises, if any, had been made inside. Alongside human mummification, ancient Egyptians mummified animals on a genuinely staggering scale, particularly during the later Ptolemaic and Roman periods, and the vast underground catacombs at Saqqara, first extensively excavated in the 1960s and 1970s, have yielded an estimated 4 to 8 million mummified ibises and roughly 500,000 mummified dogs, alongside enormous quantities of mummified cats, baboons, and other species, produced as votive offerings purchased by pilgrims and dedicated to specific gods associated with each animal, ibises to the god Thoth most prominently among them. A 2015 study using CT and X-ray imaging on a large sample of animal mummies held in European museum collections, conducted by researchers at the University of Manchester, found that roughly a third of the mummies examined contained no complete animal remains at all, instead containing partial skeletal material, or in some cases nothing recognizable as animal matter whatsoever, evidence that has led researchers to propose a large-scale, organized animal breeding and mummification industry existed specifically to meet devotional demand, one apparently substantial enough that supply sometimes failed to keep pace with demand, though exactly how centralized or regulated this industry actually was, and how ordinary worshippers reacted to, or perhaps never realized the frequent absence of a genuine animal inside the wrappings they purchased, remains only partially understood from the surviving evidence. Not every major structure the ancient Egyptians built has survived to be studied by modern archaeologists, and several of Egypt's most significant lost monuments occupy a genuinely strange middle ground in the historical record, extensively described by ancient visitors who saw them firsthand, and yet almost entirely missing from the physical, excavatable evidence available today. The most striking example is the structure ancient Greek writers called the Labyrinth, located near the pyramid of Pharaoh Amenemhet III at Hawara, roughly 100 kilometers southwest of Cairo, and built during Egypt's 12th dynasty around 1800 BCE. Herodotus, who claimed to have visited the site personally around 450 BCE, described it as a structure containing 3,000 rooms across 2 levels, 1,500 above ground and 1,500 below, connected by a maze of winding passages so complex that he wrote he would not have believed the lower rooms existed at all had Egyptian priests not personally confirmed it, adding that the entire complex, in his own assessment, surpassed even the pyramids in the sheer scale of labor required to build it. The Greek geographer Strabo, visiting considerably later around 20 BCE, independently corroborated the general scale and layout. Herodotus described, giving modern historians 2 largely independent ancient eyewitness accounts of the same vanished structure. British archaeologist Flinders Petrie excavated portions of the Hawara site beginning in 1888, confirming the existence of a genuinely massive foundation platform. Roughly 305 meters by 244 meters, consistent in scale with the ancient descriptions, but found the actual superstructure almost entirely gone, its stone blocks apparently quarried away and reused in later construction projects across the region. Over the following centuries, a common fate for ancient Egyptian monuments that fell out of active use. A 2008 geophysical survey conducted by a Belgian-Egyptian research team using ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive sensing technology detected what researchers interpreted as extensive subsurface wall structures beneath the site consistent with a genuinely vast complex, but full excavation has never been completed, due to a combination of the site's difficult waterlogged soil conditions and the sheer scale of the work required, leaving the labyrinth formally the largest ancient Egyptian structure that has never been fully investigated by modern archaeology, despite being confirmed to exist and roughly located. The Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the ancient world's 7 wonders, built during the reign of Ptolemy II, around 280 BCE on the island of Pharos, and standing an estimated 100 meters tall, remained in active use for more than 1,600 years, before a series of earthquakes, the most destructive recorded in 1303 and 1323 CE, brought the structure down entirely, leaving no trace above the waterline. French archaeologist Jean-Yves Empereur led underwater excavations beginning in 1994 that recovered more than 3,000 architectural blocks, sphinxes, and statue fragments from the harbor floor near the site, providing the first direct physical evidence of the lighthouse's construction details in more than 6 centuries, and Egyptian authorities have discussed plans for an underwater museum at the site, though as of the most recent published updates, no such museum has yet been completed, and precisely how the lighthouse's internal mechanism, believed to have used a combination of a wood or coal fire and a polished bronze mirror to project light visible from tens of kilometers away, actually functioned in full engineering detail remains only partially reconstructed from the surviving fragments and ancient written descriptions. The Library of Alexandria, founded during the early Ptolemaic period in the early 3rd century BCE, and once housing what ancient sources describe as several 100,000 papyrus scrolls, remains one of history's most frequently cited losses, and genuinely contested among historians is not whether it was eventually destroyed, but which of several historical events actually caused the loss, since ancient sources describe at least 4 separate destructive episodes spread across roughly 7 centuries. A fire during Julius Caesar's siege of Alexandria in 48 BCE, damage during Emperor Aurelian's military campaign in the 270s CE, the destruction of the affiliated Serapeum temple complex by a Christian mob under Bishop Theophilus in 391 CE, and the Muslim conquest of Alexandria in 642 CE, an event later medieval writers, considerably after the fact, controversially attributed to a deliberate burning ordered by Caliph Umar, a specific claim most modern historians treat with genuine skepticism, given how late it appears in the historical record relative to the actual event. Modern historians studying the full body of evidence generally believe the library's decline was gradual, spread across several of these episodes, and compounded by centuries of reduced funding and institutional support rather than caused by any single catastrophic event, meaning the popular image of one dramatic burning that erased the ancient world's greatest collection of knowledge in a single afternoon oversimplifies a loss that in reality unfolded and was never fully reversed across hundreds of years. Egypt's 5th dynasty pharaohs ruling roughly between 2494 and 2345 BCE, each traditionally built a dedicated sun temple honoring the god Ra, separate from their own personal pyramid tomb, a distinct category of solar monument that ancient Egyptian records confirm once numbered at least 6, built at a site called Abu Ghurab near Abusir, and yet only a single one, belonging to the pharaoh Nusere, survives today in any substantial recognizable form, first properly excavated by German archaeologists Ludwig Borchardt and Friedrich von Bissing between 1898 and 1901. Nusere's temple centered on a massive squat stone obelisk mounted on a raised platform alongside a large open courtyard containing an alabaster altar and a suite of rooms decorated with detailed relief carvings depicting the changing seasons, among the earliest such seasonal cycle depictions known from Egyptian art. The remaining 5 sun temples, referenced in Old Kingdom administrative texts and offering lists, have never been definitively located despite considerable searching, their exact positions lost entirely, their stone blocks presumably quarried away for later construction in the same pattern that claimed so many other Old Kingdom monuments, leaving Egyptologists working from written references to temples whose physical remains, unlike the labyrinth discussed earlier in this chapter, have not even been confirmed to survive underground at all, a genuine gap between what ancient administrative records confirm once existed and what modern archaeology has actually been able to locate and verify. Two enormous seated statues, known as the Colossi of Memnon, each standing roughly 18 meters tall and originally erected around 1350 BCE to guard the entrance to the now almost entirely vanished mortuary temple of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, once destroyed by Nile flooding and stone reuse over the centuries, carry their own genuinely strange documented history entirely separate from the lost temple behind them. Following a major earthquake in 27 BCE that cracked the northernmost statue, ancient visitors, including Greek and Roman travelers who left behind more than 100 surviving inscriptions carved directly onto the statue's legs, began reporting that the damaged colossus emitted an eerie singing or whistling sound shortly after sunrise each morning, a phenomenon the Greeks associated with the mythological hero Memnon, calling out to his mother, the dawn goddess Eos, giving the statues their modern name despite having no connection to Memnon in Egyptian tradition at all. Modern researchers generally attribute the sound to dew evaporating rapidly within the statue's cracked porous stone as the morning sun warmed it, causing tiny internal vibrations audible as a faint tone, a plausible physical mechanism that nonetheless cannot be directly tested today since Roman Emperor Septimius Severus ordered the cracked statue, repaired around 199 CE, in an apparent attempt to curry favor with the oracle, and the singing was never reliably reported again afterward, leaving the phenomenon's exact acoustic cause a matter of informed physical reconstruction based entirely on eyewitness description rather than any sound anyone, alive today, has actually been able to hear and study directly. Egypt's very first pyramid, the Step Pyramid of Pharaoh Djoser at Saqqara, built around 2670 BCE as the world's earliest known large-scale cut-stone monument, is traditionally credited to an architect named Imhotep, a figure whose later reputation grew so extraordinary that he was eventually deified as a god of medicine and wisdom more than 2,000 years after his death, one of the very few non-royal Egyptians ever elevated to full divine status. Imhotep's historical existence is confirmed by a contemporary inscription found on a statue base of Djoser himself, listing Imhotep's official titles, including chief architect and high priest, making him one of the earliest architects in world history whose name has survived attached to a specific, still-standing structure, and yet no tomb confirmed to be. Imhotep's own has ever been located despite extensive searching, particularly around Saqqara, where many Egyptologists believe it likely lies, leaving the final resting place of the person, credited with essentially inventing large-scale stone architecture itself among Egyptology's more ironic unsolved mysteries. A considerably earlier and genuinely instructive case of a vanished ancient monument involves the so-called Bent Pyramid, built at Dashur for the pharaoh Sneferu, Khufu's father, around 2600 BCE, whose most striking feature is immediately visible rather than lost, a distinct change in the angle of its sloping sides, roughly halfway up its height, dropping from a steep 54 degrees to a considerably shallower 43 degrees. The leading explanation, generally accepted among Egyptologists studying the structure, holds that builders detected structural instability, including cracking in the pyramid's internal chambers still visible today, and deliberately reduced the angle partway through construction specifically to prevent a catastrophic collapse, making the bent pyramid, in effect, a rare physical record of ancient Egyptian engineers actively correcting a design mistake in real time rather than a deliberate original design choice. What remains less certain is the exact sequence of internal decision-making that led to the change, since no surviving inscription or document records the reasoning directly, leaving the interpretation reconstructed entirely from the physical evidence of the stone itself, along with the broader context that Sneferu's subsequent pyramid at Dashur built with a shallower angle from its very foundation and known today as the Red Pyramid, became the first fully successful, true smooth-sided pyramid in Egyptian history, suggesting the lessons learned from the bent pyramid's near failure directly and successfully informed the design that would, within a generation, make the Great Pyramid itself possible. For more than a millennium after the last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 CE at the Temple of Isis on the island of Philae, no living person could read a single word of ancient Egyptian writing, and the script's eventual decipherment, achieved in 1822 by French scholar Jean-François Champollion, remains one of history's most celebrated breakthroughs in linguistics, even as it left and continues to leave a meaningful number of specific gaps that modern Egyptologists are still working to close. The Rosetta Stone, discovered in 1799 by French soldiers during Napoleon's Egyptian campaign near the town of Rashid, provided the essential breakthrough specifically because it recorded the identical decree issued by Pharaoh Ptolemy V in 196 BCE in 3 separate scripts: hieroglyphic, the everyday administrative Egyptian Demotic script, and ancient Greek, a language scholars could already read fluently. British polymath Thomas Young made significant early progress beginning around 1814, correctly identifying that certain hieroglyphs enclosed in oval frames called cartouches represented royal names and correctly deciphering several individual phonetic signs. But it was Champollion who, building directly on Young's work while also drawing on his own extensive knowledge of Coptic, the latest stage of the Egyptian language still used liturgically by Egypt's Christian minority, made the crucial 1822 breakthrough, recognizing that hieroglyphs functioned as a genuinely mixed system, combining phonetic sound signs with symbolic and logographic elements, rather than being purely symbolic picture writing as earlier scholars had assumed. Despite this now nearly 2-century-old decipherment, translating specific ancient Egyptian texts remains, in a meaningful number of cases, genuinely difficult rather than routine, since the writing system typically omitted vowels entirely. Similar to how modern Hebrew and Arabic are, written, meaning modern reconstructions of how individual words were actually pronounced, rely heavily on later Coptic forms and comparative linguistic reconstruction rather than any direct ancient record of Egyptian speech, leaving the precise original pronunciation of most ancient Egyptian words a matter of scholarly approximation rather than settled certainty. A considerably less resolved case involves Meroitic, the script used by the Kingdom of Kush in ancient Nubia, immediately south of Egypt, from roughly 300 BCE through 400 CE. Egyptologist Francis Llewellyn Griffith successfully worked out the phonetic values of Meroitic's individual symbols in 1909, allowing scholars to sound out Meroitic words with reasonable confidence. But the actual Meroitic language itself, unlike ancient Egyptian, has no confirmed close linguistic relative among languages that survive today, meaning modern researchers can pronounce Meroitic inscriptions without being able to fully translate what a meaningful number of them actually mean, a genuinely unusual linguistic situation in which the code for how words sound has been broken while the deeper vocabulary and grammar underlying those sounds remains only partially understood more than a century after Griffith's original breakthrough. Proto-Sinaitic script, a set of inscriptions discovered primarily in the Sinai Peninsula and dated to roughly 1900 to 1500 BCE, presents a further genuinely unresolved puzzle, since most linguists now believe it represents the earliest known alphabetic writing system, created by Semitic-speaking laborers working in Egyptian turquoise mines, who appear to have adapted the general visual appearance of Egyptian hieroglyphs to represent the sounds of their own, entirely different, Semitic language, a genuinely significant hybrid development, some linguists consider the direct ancestor of nearly every alphabet used in the world today, including the Latin alphabet this sentence would be printed in. Despite the script's outsized historical importance, only a small number of Proto-Semitic inscriptions have ever been found, and several individual symbols within the known corpus remain disputed or unconfirmed in their exact phonetic value, meaning even the birth of alphabetic writing. Itself, arguably one of the single most consequential developments in the entire history of human communication, remains only partially and incompletely documented in the surviving archaeological record. Egyptian hieratic and demotic, the faster, more cursive everyday writing systems used for administrative records, personal letters, and legal documents, rather than the formal, carefully carved hieroglyphs, reserved primarily for temple and tomb inscriptions together, make up the overwhelming majority of surviving ancient Egyptian written material, and a genuinely significant portion of this administrative material, held in museum and university collections worldwide, remains formally untranslated and even uncatalogued in detail, simply due to the sheer volume of surviving papyri relative to the comparatively small number of specialists trained to read these particular scripts fluently, meaning a meaningful amount of Egypt's own written record likely still sits quietly on storage shelves, its specific contents genuinely unknown to modern scholarship, not because the writing itself is undecipherable, but because no one has yet had the time to read it. Egyptian mathematics survives primarily through a small handful of documents, most significantly the Rhind mathematical papyrus, copied around 1650 BCE by a scribe named Ahmes from an even older document he claims dated back several centuries earlier, containing 84 separate mathematical problems covering fractions, geometry, and practical calculations for tasks like measuring grain storage and land area. The papyrus demonstrates a genuinely sophisticated working command of applied mathematics, including a method for approximating the value of pi accurate to within about 0.5%, achieved without any of the formal algebraic notation modern mathematics relies on, and Egyptologists studying the text continue to debate precisely how Egyptian scribes originally arrived at several of the papyrus's more advanced geometric formulas, since the document itself records only the final procedures and worked examples rather than any underlying derivation or explanation of the reasoning that produced them, leaving the specific method by which Egyptian mathematicians actually discovered several of their more elegant solutions a matter of modern reconstruction rather than direct ancient explanation. A third significant king list, carved in considerably better preserved condition on a temple wall at Abydos during the reign of Seti Erst around 1290 BCE, lists 76 pharaohs in careful chronological order, yet pointedly and deliberately omits several rulers modern Egyptologists know from other sources to have genuinely reigned, most notably Hatshepsut and the entire Amarna period kings, including Akhenaten, Smenkhkare, and, for reasons that remain particularly striking given his later fame, Tutankhamun himself. Egyptologists studying the Abydos list generally interpret these specific omissions as deliberate rather than accidental, reflecting later Egyptian efforts to erase rulers considered religiously or politically illegitimate, Hatshepsut for having ruled as a woman outside the traditional male succession, and the Amarna kings for their association with Akhenaten's abandoned and deeply unpopular religious revolution from Egypt's own official historical memory. What remains less certain is exactly how centrally coordinated this erasure effort actually was, whether ordered directly from the royal court as deliberate state policy, or carried out more informally by individual temple priests, reflecting the religious orthodoxy of their own particular era, a specific question about the mechanics of ancient historical censorship that the surviving evidence does not fully settle either way. A genuinely striking literary puzzle involves the instructions of Amenemope, an Egyptian wisdom text composed sometime between roughly 1300 and 1075 BCE, offering practical moral guidance, structured as advice from a father to his son. When British Museum curator E.A. Wallace Budge first published the text's translation in 1923, biblical scholars quickly noticed strikingly close parallels between specific passages of Amenemope and the biblical book of Proverbs, particularly chapter 22, verses 17 through 24, with entire phrases and structural patterns matching closely enough that most biblical scholars now generally accept some form of direct or indirect literary influence flowed from the Egyptian text toward the biblical one, most likely through Hebrew scribes with access to Egyptian wisdom literature. During the period, the relevant sections of Proverbs were being compiled. The exact mechanism of that transmission, whether through direct translation, a shared and now lost intermediate source both texts independently drew from, or a more gradual process of ideas circulating across the ancient Near East's interconnected scribal culture, remains genuinely unresolved among biblical and Egyptological scholars alike, a specific and still debated question about how directly two of the ancient world's most significant literary traditions may have influenced one another. Two of Egyptology's most important surviving king lists, documents that would otherwise settle a considerable amount of chronological uncertainty about the order and length of pharaonic reigns, exist today only in frustratingly fragmentary form. The Palermo stone, a black basalt slab inscribed during the 5th dynasty, around 2400 BCE, recording annual events and Nile flood levels for kings stretching back to before the 1st dynasty, survives only as 7 separate fragments scattered across museum collections in Palermo, Cairo, and London, believed to represent perhaps a tenth of the original inscribed surface, with the remainder lost entirely and its specific contents permanently unrecoverable. The Turin King List, a papyrus compiled during the reign of Ramesses II, around 1200 BCE, listing Egyptian rulers from the mythological age of the gods through the New Kingdom, suffered a more recent and genuinely avoidable loss, arriving in Europe in 1822 in reasonably intact condition before being packed carelessly for transport, an incident that shattered the fragile papyrus into hundreds of loose fragments. Egyptologists have spent the 2 centuries since attempting to painstakingly reassemble, like a puzzle with no reference picture, a reconstruction effort that continues into the present day and that has never fully restored several sections, leaving gaps in Egypt's own most detailed ancient chronological record that no amount of careful piecing back together has been able to close entirely. On November 4, 1922, British archaeologist Howard Carter, funded by his patron Lord Carnarvon, after years of largely unsuccessful excavation in the Valley of the Kings, uncovered a step cut into the bedrock that led to the nearly intact tomb of a comparatively minor pharaoh named Tutankhamun, who had died around 1323 BCE at approximately 19 years old, a discovery that remains, more than a century later, the single most famous archaeological find in Egyptian history, precisely because the tomb had escaped the large-scale looting that had stripped nearly every other pharaoh's burial in the Valley of the Kings clean centuries earlier. The popular legend of the mummy's curse, which claimed a supernatural retribution, struck down those who disturbed Tutankhamun's tomb, gained widespread traction after Lord Carnarvon died just months later, in April 1923, from an infected mosquito bite that developed into blood poisoning, a death sensationalized heavily by contemporary newspapers eager for a dramatic story. A rigorous statistical study published in the British Medical Journal in 2002 by researcher Mark Nelson examined the actual mortality records of the 44 Westerners known to have been present at either the tomb's opening or the subsequent unwrapping of the mummy, and found their average age at death and overall life expectancy showed no statistically significant difference from a comparable control group, directly undermining the curse narrative using the same kind of careful evidentiary standard applied to any other medical or historical claim, though the myth itself has persisted in popular culture regardless of the statistical debunking. What remains genuinely scientifically debated, considerably more so than any supernatural curse, is the precise cause of Tutankhamun's own early death. A comprehensive 2010 study led by Egyptologist Zahi Hawass, combining CT scans and DNA analysis of the mummy alongside several related royal mummies, found evidence of a badly broken left leg, a genetic marker consistent with a severe malaria infection, and several skeletal abnormalities, including a cleft palate and mild scoliosis, consistent with health complications that researchers linked to Tutankhamun's parents likely being full siblings. A common practice within Egypt's royal family intended to preserve bloodline purity. The 2010 study's specific conclusion that a combination of the broken leg, subsequent infection, and malaria most likely caused Tutankhamun's death has not achieved full consensus, and competing researchers have proposed alternative explanations in subsequent years, including a 2013 hypothesis from a British documentary team suggesting the leg injury resulted from a high-speed chariot accident, leaving the precise, specific chain of events that killed a 19-year-old pharaoh more than 3,300 years ago. Still, in meaningful respects, an open medical and historical question rather than a fully settled one. A separate and genuinely still unresolved mystery involves the tomb's own physical layout, which Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves proposed in a Wileg's 2015 paper might conceal additional hidden chambers behind the tomb's north and west walls, based on Reeves's close analysis of high-resolution scans of the tomb's painted plaster surfaces, revealing faint linear features he interpreted as evidence of sealed doorways. Reeves specifically speculated the hidden space might contain the undiscovered burial of Queen Nefertiti, based on his broader theory that Tutankhamun's tomb was originally built for her and later repurposed. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 2016 and 2018 by separate international research teams produced directly conflicting results, with the first survey reporting possible voids consistent with Reeves's theory and the most extensive survey finding no clear evidence of any hidden chamber at all, leaving the entire hypothesis formally unresolved, and Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities has not authorized further invasive investigation as of the most recent published updates, meaning one of archaeology's most tantalizing recent proposals remains for now genuinely untested rather than confirmed or disproven. The craftsmanship of Tutankhamun's iconic golden death mask, weighing approximately 11 kilograms and constructed from two separately cast sheets of high-purity gold fused together, along with inlaid semi-precious stones and colored glass, continues to generate specific technical questions among conservators and metallurgists since a 2015 conservation incident in which the mask's ceremonial beard was accidentally knocked loose and hastily reattached using ordinary epoxy adhesive by museum staff was only publicly revealed and properly corrected the following year, an episode that, beyond its own controversy, prompted renewed scientific study of the mask's original ancient construction techniques, revealing manufacturing details, including evidence the mask may have originally been made for a different, unidentified royal individual before being adapted for Tutankhamun specifically, that continue to be actively studied and debated by researchers working with the artifact today. Howard Carter's own official account of the tomb's discovery describes him and Lord Carnarvon waiting patiently for official government witnesses before formally breaking through into the burial chamber itself, a version of events that stood essentially unquestioned for more than 50 years. A private letter written by one of Carter's own colleagues, archaeologist Alfred Lucas, and only made public in the 1970s, along with subsequent research by Egyptologist Thomas Hoving, published in 1978, suggests Carter and Carnarvon, in fact, secretly broke through a smaller hole into the burial chamber several days before the official, witnessed opening, taking a private, unauthorized look at Tutankhamun's actual sarcophagus, and then carefully concealing the breach before resealing it for the official ceremony. Egyptologists studying the discrepancy generally treat the unauthorized early entry as highly plausible, given the surviving physical and documentary evidence. A genuinely human detail suggesting Carter's own carefully polished public account of history's most famous archaeological discovery was, in at least this one specific respect, a deliberately incomplete version of what actually happened inside the tomb. A genuinely striking and still unresolved diplomatic mystery involves Tutankhamun's young widow, Ankhesenamun, who, according to a set of Hittite royal archives excavated at the site of ancient Hattusa in modern Turkey, wrote directly to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma, sometime shortly after her husband's death, a letter preserved in the Hittite king's own official annals, rather than in any surviving Egyptian source, in which she reportedly wrote that she would never take one of her own subjects as a husband, and asked the Hittite king to send one of his sons to marry her and become pharaoh instead. Suppiluliuma I, according to the same Hittite records, initially suspected a trick before eventually sending his son Zananza, who died, according to the Hittite account, before ever reaching Egypt under circumstances the Hittite records themselves leave frustratingly vague. Egyptologists remain genuinely divided over central details of the episode, including whether the widowed queen described in the Hittite archive was actually Ankhesenamun at all, since Egyptian sources never confirm her authorship of any such letter, and over who within Egypt's court might have arranged Zananza's death, if the killing was indeed deliberate rather than accidental, with the powerful courtier and eventual pharaoh Oi, who married Ankhesenamun himself not long afterward, and inherited the throne, frequently named as the most likely suspect by researchers reconstructing the episode's political logic, though no direct Egyptian evidence has ever confirmed his involvement, leaving one of the ancient world's most genuinely dramatic diplomatic incidents preserved only from the losing side's own archive. The most significant new discovery in the Valley of the Kings since Tutankhamun's tomb itself came in February 2005, when a team led by American archaeologist Otto Schaden located a previously unknown shaft designated KV-63, situated only about 15 meters from Tutankhamun's own tomb entrance, generating immediate widespread speculation and international media attention that a second intact royal burial had finally been found. Excavation revealed the chamber instead contained an embalming cache rather than a tomb, 7 wooden coffins holding no human remains at all, but instead pillows, linens, natron salt, and pottery vessels bearing residue consistent with materials used during mummification, alongside seals referencing several members of the royal family connected to Tutankhamun's own reign. The specific individual or individuals whose embalming generated this particular cache of used ritual material has never been conclusively identified, and Egyptologists remain genuinely divided over whether the material relates directly to Tutankhamun's own funeral preparations or to a different royal burial from roughly the same period, leaving KV-63 despite being the most significant valley of the king's discovery in more than 80 years, a find whose precise connection to the pharaohs buried nearby remains only partially resolved. Among the more quietly poignant finds within Tutankhamun's own tomb were 2 small, undecorated wooden coffins, each containing a separately mummified fetus, generally believed based on their positioning and treatment to represent Tutankhamun's own stillborn daughters lost before or during pregnancy with his wife Ankhesenamun. Once upon a time, a 2011 genetic and radiological study led by Zahi Hawass confirmed a father-daughter relationship between Tutankhamun and both fetuses through DNA analysis and detailed examination found one fetus, estimated at around 25 weeks of gestation, showed evidence of Sprengel's deformity, spina bifida, and scoliosis, skeletal abnormality. Researchers have connected to the same pattern of health complications, including the effects of close royal intermarriage, identified elsewhere in Tutankhamun's own remains. Precisely why the two fetuses were mummified and buried alongside their father with the same ritual care given to a full pharaonic burial, rather than through whatever more modest funerary treatment may have been typical for an ordinary stillbirth in ancient Egypt, remains a matter of interpretation rather than direct textual confirmation, since no accompanying inscription explains the specific religious reasoning behind their inclusion in the royal tomb. Carved into the interior walls of the pyramid of Pharaoh Yunus at Saqqara, who died around 2345 BCE at the close of Egypt's 5th dynasty, sits the earliest known collection of ancient Egyptian religious writing, a set of 228 individual spells and rituals. Modern Egyptologists call the pyramid texts, representing not only Egypt's oldest surviving religious literature, but among the oldest religious texts of any kind discovered anywhere in the world. The pyramid texts were first systematically translated and published in the late 19th century by French Egyptologist Gaston Maspero, whose work revealed a body of religious material considerably more complex and internally varied than earlier, simpler assumptions about ancient Egyptian afterlife belief had suggested, including spells addressing the deceased pharaoh's ascension to join the sun god Ra, his identification with the god Osiris, and detailed instructions intended to help him navigate the four dangers of the afterlife journey. What remains genuinely unresolved among Egyptologists studying the texts is the question of authorship and original composition date, since internal linguistic evidence suggests several of the individual spells were already old, drawing on considerably earlier oral or written religious tradition by the time they were first carved into Unes's pyramid walls around 2345 BCE, meaning the texts as preserved represent a snapshot of a much older, and now otherwise entirely lost, religious tradition whose full original scope and earliest form can only be partially reconstructed from what survived to be carved in stone centuries after its origin. The pyramid texts gradually evolved over the following centuries into the considerably more widely known coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom and eventually the Book of the Dead of the New Kingdom, a body of funerary literature that expanded from an exclusively royal privilege, since only pharaohs were originally granted access to these specific afterlife spells, into material available to wealthy non-royal individuals who could afford to have relevant texts copied onto their own coffins and later onto dedicated papyrus scrolls. This democratization of afterlife access, as Egyptologists frequently describe it, unfolded gradually across roughly 1,000 years, and the specific social and religious factors driving exactly why and how quickly this expansion occurred, whether primarily religious reform, changing political structures, or simple economic opportunity among scribes and priests eager to sell an expanding market of funerary texts, remains a genuinely debated question without full consensus among historians of Egyptian religion. Central to the entire Book of the Dead tradition is the weighing of the heart ceremony, depicted vividly across numerous surviving papyri, in which the deceased's heart, believed to record the moral weight of every action taken during life, was placed on a scale against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess representing truth, balance, and cosmic order, with a heart found heavier than the feather condemned to be devoured by the composite monster Ammit, resulting in the deceased's permanent non-existence rather than any form of punishment resembling later religious concepts of hell or damnation. This specific framing of judgment resulting in outright annihilation rather than eternal suffering represents a genuinely distinct theological structure compared to most other major world religious traditions, and Egyptologists studying the ceremony's development continue to debate precisely how literally ordinary ancient Egyptians understood and feared this specific outcome, versus treating the ceremony as a more symbolic, ritually managed formality most individuals expected to pass successfully, given the wide availability of protective spells and amulets specifically designed to help ensure a favorable result. The opening of the mouth ceremony, performed on both mummified bodies and notably on statues and images of the deceased, involved a priest touching specialized ritual instruments to the mouth and eyes of the mummy or statue, a ritual ancient Egyptian texts describe as magically restoring the senses, allowing the deceased to breathe, speak, eat, and see again in the afterlife. Surviving depictions of the ceremony, including detailed scenes carved in numerous New Kingdom tombs, show considerable variation in the specific instruments and exact sequence of actions used across different periods and regions, and Egyptologists have not fully reconstructed a single, universally consistent version of the ritual's precise original form, since the ceremony appears to have been adapted and modified across the many centuries it remained in continuous use, leaving modern scholars working from a composite, somewhat variable picture assembled across a wide span of surviving evidence rather than any single authoritative original source. Underlying all of this ritual practice was a genuinely complex Egyptian concept of the human soul, understood not as a single unified entity the way most later Western religious traditions describe it, but as a set of at least 5 or more separate spiritual components, each requiring its own specific care and ritual maintenance after death. The Ka, generally translated as a person's vital life force or spiritual double, was believed to require ongoing physical sustenance, even after death, explaining the elaborate food and drink offerings left in tombs and depicted in tomb art for the Ka to symbolically consume, while the Ba, usually depicted in art as a human-headed bird, represented the individual personality and was believed capable of leaving the tomb during the day to move freely through the world before returning each night, a specific division of labor between these two components that Egyptologists studying the concept still debate the precise practical and theological boundaries of, since surviving texts describe the Ka and Ba's respective roles with genuine but incomplete consistency across different periods. A third element, the Ak, represented the fully transfigured, affective spirit a person hopefully became after successfully completing the afterlife journey and passing judgment, uniting aspects of the Ka and Ba into a single functioning divine being, and Egyptologist Louis Jabkar's influential 1968 study of the concept concluded that ancient Egyptian texts themselves were never fully consistent or systematic in explaining precisely how or when this transformation from Ka and Ba into a unified Akek was actually believed to occur, meaning even the ancient Egyptians' own religious specialists appear to have worked with a genuinely flexible, evolving theological model rather than one single fixed doctrine that modern scholars could simply translate and present as a complete, settled system. Among the more visually striking pieces of Middle Kingdom funerary literature is the Book of Two Ways, painted on the floors of wooden coffins found primarily at the site of Deir el-Bersha and dating to roughly 2000 BCE, generally recognized by Egyptologists as the oldest surviving illustrated map of any kind, depicting two separate routes, one by water and one by land, that the deceased spirit needed to navigate through a landscape of fire lakes, guardian, demons, and mythological obstacles in order to safely reach the afterlife realm ruled by Osiris. Egyptologist Leonard Lesko's detailed 1972 study of the surviving Book of Two Ways coffins found meaningful variation in the specific route, obstacles, and accompanying spells depicted between different coffins, evidence that no single, universally standardized version of the map existed even within the same general period and region, leaving scholars uncertain whether these variations reflect genuinely different regional religious traditions, the individual preferences and errors of different workshop scribes copying from imperfect source material, or some combination of both, a specific question about the text's transmission that remains without full resolution. By the late New Kingdom, tomb robbery had become such a widespread and persistent problem in the Valley of the Kings that Egyptian priests took the extraordinary step of secretly relocating dozens of royal mummies, moving them out of their original, individually looted tombs, and consolidating them together in hidden, more defensible locations for protection. The larger of these two secret caches, designated TT-320 and located in a cliff face at Deir el-Bahari, was discovered, not by archaeologists but by local antiquities looters from the Abd el-Rasul family, who had been quietly selling artifacts from the site for roughly a decade before Egyptian authorities, alerted by suspicious objects appearing on the antiquities market, finally traced the source and officially excavated the cache in 1881, recovering more than 50 royal mummies, including several of Egypt's most famous pharaohs, among them Ramesses II and Thutmose III, all found rewrapped and relabeled by ancient priests centuries after their original burial. Precisely how the Abd el-Rasul family first discovered the hidden cache, and exactly how long they had been secretly accessing it before authorities intervened, remains only partially documented, since the family's own accounts, given under considerable official pressure at the time, are treated by historians as an incomplete and likely self-protective record of the actual discovery. The judgment scene itself, beyond the central weighing of the heart already described, involved the deceased reciting what Egyptologists call the negative confession, a lengthy declaration addressed to a panel of 42 divine assessors, each representing a specific Egyptian province, in which the deceased denied having committed 42 corresponding specific sins, ranging from murder and theft to more surprising entries like disturbing floodwaters or being deaf to words of truth. Surviving copies of the negative confession across different Book of the Dead papyri show meaningful variation in the exact list and ordering of both the sins denied and the specific assessors named, and Egyptologists have never fully reconstructed a single definitive original version, since the spell appears to have been actively copied, adapted, and occasionally reordered by different scribes across different periods and regions, rather than transmitted from one single fixed master text, leaving even this comparatively well-documented central ritual moment preserved today only as a family of related, but not perfectly identical versions. A considerably more elaborate and standardized New Kingdom successor, the Amduat, meaning that which is in the underworld, maps the sun god Ra's nightly journey through 12 distinct hours of the underworld in exhaustive, carefully organized detail, first appearing in full form painted on the walls of Pharaoh Thutmose I's tomb around 1500 BCE and continuing in use for centuries afterward. The text describes specific named regions, guardian deities, and dangers, including the god Ra's confrontation each night with the serpent Apophis, embodiment of primordial chaos, a battle the sun god must win to ensure his safe rebirth as dawn the following morning. And while the Amduat's overall structure remained remarkably stable, across the centuries of its recorded use, Egyptologists comparing different tomb versions have identified subtle but genuine discrepancies in specific details between copies separated by only a few generations, whose precise theological significance, whether meaningful doctrinal evolution or simple scribal variation, remains a matter of ongoing scholarly interpretation rather than settled agreement. Among the most enduringly recognizable faces from the ancient world belongs to Queen Nefertiti, the principal wife of the pharaoh Akhenaten, who ruled during Egypt's radical religious revolution of the 14th century BCE, and yet, despite her painted limestone bust, discovered in 1912 by German archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt at the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose in Amarna, and now displayed in Berlin's Neues Museum. Being one of the most reproduced images from all of ancient history, Nefertiti's actual tomb and her mummified remains have never been definitively identified. Several candidate mummies discovered in the Valley of the Kings have been proposed as Nefertiti over the decades, most notably a mummy discovered within tomb KV35 in 1898 and informally nicknamed the Younger Lady, subjected to DNA analysis as part of Zahi Hawas's broader 2010 Royal Mummy Study, which confirmed the Younger Lady was both the biological mother of Tutankhamun and a full sibling of Tutankhamun's father. Akhenaten, a genetic finding that, while establishing the Younger Lady's close royal relation, has not been definitively matched to Nefertiti specifically, since historical records leave some ambiguity about whether Nefertiti, or a different royal sister-wife of Akhenaten, was actually Tutankhamun's mother, meaning the Younger Lady's precise identity remains a genuinely unresolved question even after direct genetic testing. Nicholas Reeves's 2015 hidden chamber theory, discussed in the previous chapter regarding Tutankhamun's tomb, specifically proposed Nefertiti's undiscovered burial might lie directly behind its walls, a hypothesis that, following the inconclusive 2016 and 2018 radar surveys, remains formally neither confirmed nor ruled out, leaving one of ancient Egypt's most famous women still, in the most literal sense, missing. Cleopatra VII, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and the historical figure most people picture when they think of ancient Egyptian royalty, despite her Greek Macedonian ancestry, died by suicide in 30 BCE following Rome's conquest of Egypt, and her tomb, which ancient sources including the Roman historian Plutarch describe her ordering, built adjacent to a temple of Isis before her death, has never been located by modern archaeologists. Dominican archaeologist Kathleen Martinez has led an extensive ongoing excavation since 2005 at the temple complex of Taposiris Magna, roughly 45 kilometers west of Alexandria, a site she believes matches ancient descriptions of Cleopatra's intended burial. Location and her team's excavations have uncovered coins bearing Cleopatra's image, a substantial temple structure, and an extensive network of underground tunnels. But as of the most recent published updates, no tomb definitively confirmed as belonging to Cleopatra or her lover Mark Antony has been found, leaving one of history's most famous rulers, alongside Nefertiti, among ancient Egypt's most significant missing burials. Queen Hatshepsut, who ruled as pharaoh in her own right during the 15th century BCE, one of the very small number of women to hold the full title of pharaoh rather than merely queen consort, presents a different but genuinely related mystery, since a large number of her statues and inscriptions were deliberately defaced or destroyed. Following her death, a systematic erasure historians call damnatio memoriae, generally attributed to her stepson and successor, Thutmose III. Precise motive behind Thutmose III's campaign against his stepmother's memory remains genuinely debated among Egyptologists, since the destruction appears to have begun only well into his own reign rather than immediately after. Hatshepsut's death, a delay that has led some researchers to propose the erasure, was less a personal act of resentment and more a calculated political effort to secure his own son's succession by eliminating the precedent of a female pharaoh, though other historians continue to argue for a more straightforward interpretation centered on personal or dynastic rivalry, leaving Hatshepsut's specific relationship with her successor and his true motivation for erasing her without full scholarly consensus. A final and considerably more recently resolved case, useful specifically as a point of contrast to the still missing queens discussed above, involves Queen Hetepher's mother of Khufu, whose intact burial equipment, though not her actual mummified body, was discovered in 1925 by American archaeologist George Reisner in a deep, sealed shaft near the Giza pyramids. Reisner's excavation recovered an extraordinarily well-preserved gold-cased wooden furniture set, including a bed, chair, and canopy, alongside a sealed canopic chest confirmed through later analysis to contain her actual internal organs. Yet her sarcophagus itself, when finally opened, was found completely empty, her mummy missing entirely, a genuine puzzle. Reisner and later Egyptologists have proposed several competing explanations for, including the possibility she was originally buried elsewhere and later reburied at Giza without her actual body, or that ancient looters removed the mummy specifically while leaving the equally valuable burial goods untouched for reasons that remain unclear, a mystery that, unlike Nefertiti's or Cleopatra's still missing tombs entirely, involves a burial site fully located and excavated in extraordinary detail, while its single most basic question, where the queen's actual body itself ended up, remains completely unanswered. Queen Ti, principal wife of Pharaoh Amenhotep III and grandmother of Tutankhamun, offers a genuinely rare case in which a royal mummy's identity was eventually confirmed through a specific and almost accidental piece of physical evidence. A small, carefully wrapped lock of hair inscribed with Ti's name and found among Tutankhamun's own tomb goods in 1922 sat in storage for more than 8 decades before being directly compared as part of Zahi Hawass's 2010 royal mummy DNA study against hair samples taken from a previously unidentified elderly female mummy discovered in tomb KV35 in 1898 and known for decades only as the Elder Lady. The comparison confirmed a precise match, definitively identifying the Elder Lady as Queen Ti herself. More than a century after her mummy had first been found and catalogued without anyone knowing whose remains they were actually looking at. A genuinely striking illustration of how a royal mummy can sit, correctly excavated, physically present, and completely unidentified in a museum storage room for generations, simply for lack of the one small comparative sample needed to finally confirm the connection. Among the most genuinely tangled identity puzzles in all of Egyptology involves a shadowy figure named Smenkhkar, attested only briefly in the historical record during the turbulent final years of Akhenaten's religious revolution, whose relationship to the royal family, and even whose basic gender, remains formally disputed among specialists. Some Egyptologists have proposed Smenkhkare was a genuine male co-regent who briefly ruled alongside or immediately after Akhenaten, before Tutankhamun's own accession, while others have argued the name may actually represent a specific throne name adopted by Nefertiti herself, ruling in her own right under a modified royal identity. During Egypt's uncertain succession crisis, a theory that would make her, alongside Hatshepsut, one of only a small handful of women confirmed to have ruled Egypt as pharaoh in her own right. A mummy discovered in tomb KV55 in 1907, believed by most researchers based on 2010 DNA analysis to represent Akhenaten himself, was initially proposed by some earlier researchers as a possible candidate for Smenkhkar, a specific identification. The DNA findings have since substantially undermined without fully resolving who Smenkhkar actually was, leaving the question a genuine, actively debated puzzle sitting at the intersection of two of Egyptology's most contested areas, the chaotic succession following Akhenaten's death and the persistent uncertainty over Nefertiti's own final years and fate. Nefertiti and Akhenaten's 6 known daughters, prominently and repeatedly depicted together as a family throughout the extensive artwork surviving from their new capital city at Amarna, largely vanished from the historical record almost entirely once the Amarna period itself came to its abrupt end. Meketaten, the second daughter, is confirmed to have died young, her death scene actually depicted in a royal tomb relief showing her. Grieving parents, but the fates of her remaining sisters, including Meritaten and Ankhesenamun, who reappear only briefly afterward as adult wives married into the following generation's uncertain royal succession, are documented only in scattered, incomplete fragments, and at least 2 of the 6 daughters disappear from all surviving Egyptian records so completely that Egyptologists cannot confirm whether they died in childhood, were married into unrecorded circumstances, or met some other fate entirely, leaving several of ancient Egypt's most extensively and affectionately painted royal children among its most quietly, completely lost individuals. Cleopatra's own younger sister, Arsinoe IV, adds a further genuinely unresolved thread to this chapter's catalogue of missing royal women. Arsinoe briefly challenged Cleopatra for the Egyptian throne during the political chaos of the Alexandrian War in 48 to 47 BCE, before being captured and exiled to the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, in modern Turkey, where she was eventually executed around 41 BCE on Mark Antony's orders, reportedly at Cleopatra's own request, according to the Roman historian Appian. Austrian archaeologist Hilke Thür, excavating a distinctive octagonal tomb structure at Ephesus in the 1990s, proposed the burial belonged to Arsinoe herself, based on skeletal remains recovered from the tomb decades earlier in 1926 and preserved since in Vienna, and a widely reported 2009. Forensic analysis of the skull suggested the individual's estimated age and possible mixed Egyptian-Greek ancestry were broadly consistent with Arsinoe. Subsequent independent researchers have directly challenged this identification, noting the original 1926 excavation records were incomplete enough to leave real doubt about whether the analyzed skull was even recovered from the correct part of the tomb, and the skeletal remains themselves have since gone missing from their Vienna storage location entirely, meaning modern DNA testing that could potentially resolve the question definitively is no longer even possible, leaving Arsinoe's identification at Ephesus a genuinely disputed claim rather than a confirmed discovery. Ancient Egypt's economy and material culture depended on a genuinely extensive network of long-distance trade and resource acquisition, and several specific aspects of exactly how and how far that network actually extended remain only partially documented, despite the wealth of surviving Egyptian material evidence connected to trade more broadly. Among the most persistently debated is the exact geographic location of the land of Punt, a trading partner extensively depicted in Egyptian reliefs, most famously in an elaborate series of scenes carved at Queen Hatshepsut's mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari around 1470 BCE, documenting a major trading expedition that returned with frankincense, myrrh, gold, ebony, ivory, and live exotic animals, including giraffes and baboons. Egyptian texts describe Punt's approximate direction and the goods available there in considerable detail, but never specify its exact location using any system of geography. Modern researchers can directly translate into a fixed point on a map and proposed candidates advanced by different research teams over the past century have included regions of modern-day Eritrea, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen, with a 2010 isotopic analysis of mummified baboon remains believed based on Egyptian inscriptions to have originated from Punt, led by researcher Nathaniel Dominy, finding a chemical signature most closely consistent with the region spanning modern Eritrea and Ethiopia, a genuinely useful piece of physical evidence that has narrowed without fully closing one of Egyptology's longest-running geographic debates. Egyptian long-distance timber acquisition presents a considerably better documented but still partially mysterious trade relationship, since Egypt's own environment produced almost no timber suitable for large-scale construction or shipbuilding, forcing consistent reliance on cedar imported from the Lebanese coast, particularly the city of Byblos, a trade relationship documented as early as the Old Kingdom and continuing for more than 2,000 years. The report of Wenamun, an Egyptian papyrus dating to roughly 1075 BCE, provides a genuinely rare first-hand narrative account of this timber trade in practice, describing an Egyptian official's difficult negotiations with the ruler of Byblos over payment. For cedar logs, a text whose considerable literary sophistication has led some scholars to debate whether it represents a factual travel account, a work of deliberate historical fiction, or some blend of both, a genuine and still unresolved question of genre that affects how literary historians should treat its specific details. The technical origin of Egyptian faience, a distinctive blue-green glazed ceramic material manufactured from crushed quartz rather than clay, and used extensively for jewelry, amulets, and decorative tiles. Beginning as early as 3500 BCE, remains only partially understood at the level of precise original manufacturing technique, since the specific glazing method, requiring the material to be either coated in a glaze mixture before firing or in a more technically demanding alternative called efflorescence glazing, mixed with soluble salts that migrate to the surface and form the glaze automatically during drying and firing, appears to have varied across different workshops and periods, and modern researchers attempting to fully replicate ancient faience production have found the precise combination of temperature, timing, and material ratios used by specific ancient workshops difficult to reconstruct exactly, despite faience being one of humanity's earliest engineered ceramic materials. Egyptian core formed glass vessels, small decorative containers manufactured by winding molten glass around a removable clay core, appear suddenly and in relatively sophisticated form in the archaeological record beginning around 1500 BCE during the reign of Thutmose III, without the kind of gradual incremental developmental sequence archaeologists typically expect to find preceding a genuinely new manufacturing technology. This abrupt appearance has fueled a long-running debate over whether Egyptian glassmaking represents an independent local invention or a technology imported wholesale from Mesopotamia or the Syro-Palestinian region, where somewhat earlier glass fragments have also been found, and chemical analysis of early Egyptian glass composition conducted across several studies since the 1990s has produced genuinely mixed results, with some samples showing raw material signatures consistent with imported foreign glass and others, suggesting local Egyptian production using domestic raw materials, evidence that has led most current researchers toward a middle position, proposing the underlying technique likely arrived from the Near East while Egyptian craftsmen rapidly developed their own distinct styles and local production capacity, though the exact sequence and timing of that technological transfer remains without full scholarly consensus. Once directly south of Egypt, the kingdom of Kush centered for much of its later history around the city of Meroe in modern Sudan, built considerably more pyramids than Egypt itself, more than 200 smaller, steeper-angled royal pyramids constructed between roughly 300 BCE and 300 CE, a genuinely striking testament to how far Egyptian architectural and religious influence spread and was independently adapted by a neighboring culture over the centuries. Many of these Nubian pyramids suffered catastrophic and entirely needless damage in 1834, when Italian treasure hunter Giuseppe Ferlini, convinced by a mistaken theory that gold treasure was hidden inside the structures themselves rather than in chambers beneath them, systematically demolished the tops of more than 40 pyramids searching for riches, an act of destruction that did yield some genuine gold jewelry, since Ferlini's crude methods actually did stumble onto burial goods within a small number of the structures, but that permanently destroyed the original architectural integrity of dozens of ancient monuments in the process. Modern archaeologists studying the Meroe pyramids continue working to reconstruct exactly how many additional royal burials and what portion of Kush's own material history was permanently lost during Ferlini's brief but devastating expedition. A loss compounded by the fact that Kushitic history more broadly remains considerably less thoroughly excavated and documented than Egypt's own, leaving Nubia's own parallel pyramid-building tradition still only partially studied relative to its northern neighbors. A specific and genuinely striking piece of physical evidence for ancient Egyptian material sourcing involves an iron dagger discovered among Tutankhamun's tomb goods, whose blade, unusual for its era since Egypt had not yet developed reliable iron-smelting technology when the pharaoh died around 1323 BCE, was confirmed through X-ray fluorescence analysis published in 2016 by an Italian-Egyptian research team to be made from meteoric iron, identified through its distinctive high nickel content, matching known meteorite composition rather than any terrestrial iron ore. The specific meteorite source has been tentatively linked, based on comparative chemical analysis, to a documented meteorite that fell near the Red Sea coast, though how exactly Egyptian metalworkers identified, acquired, and successfully worked this specific rare material into a finished blade at a level of technical sophistication their culture would not achieve with ordinary terrestrial iron for centuries, afterward remains a genuinely open question about ancient Egyptian metallurgical knowledge and practice. Egyptian blue, the pigment identified earlier in tonight's video within the Fayum mummy portraits, holds the additional distinction of being the first fully synthetic pigment manufactured by any human civilization, produced by heating a precise mixture of silica sand, copper compounds, calcium, and an alkali flux to temperatures around 850 to 1000 degrees Celsius, a process requiring genuinely sophisticated kiln control that Egyptian craftsmen had mastered by at least 2500 BCE. Modern chemists studying surviving samples have found the pigment possesses a genuinely unusual physical property beyond its color, emitting infrared radiation when exposed to visible light, a property discovered and published in detail only in 2009, more than 4,500 years after the pigment was first manufactured, a finding that has since led conservation scientists to use specialized infrared imaging to detect trace, otherwise invisible remnants of Egyptian blue pigment on ancient artifacts and monuments where the visible paint has long since faded away entirely, a genuinely modern scientific application built directly on an ancient Egyptian chemical innovation whose original inventors could have had no way of knowing about the specific physical property that would eventually make their invention useful to archaeologists thousands of years later. Still lying exactly where ancient workers abandoned it in a granite quarry near Aswan is what would have been ancient Egypt's largest obelisk ever attempted, a single stone shaft measuring nearly 42 meters long and weighing an estimated 1,200 tons, roughly twice the weight of any obelisk successfully completed and erected in antiquity. Quarry workers cutting the massive shaft directly out of the surrounding granite bedrock using nothing more than dolerite pounding stones harder than the granite itself abandoned the project. After a series of natural fractures appeared in the stone, cracks still clearly visible today running across the unfinished obelisk's surface. The unfinished obelisk, left in place for more than 3,000 years and only fully excavated in the 20th century, has become one of Egyptology's most valuable direct windows into ancient quarrying techniques, specifically because its incomplete state preserves tool marks, working methods, and construction stages that would otherwise have been entirely erased by the final smoothing and polishing applied to every obelisk that was actually completed, even as the exact logistics of how Egyptian workers intended to free, transport, and ultimately raise a single stone this massive, had the project succeeded, remain a matter of engineering reconstruction and informed estimate rather than any surviving Egyptian technical description. Egypt's substantial gold wealth, extracted primarily from mines in the eastern desert and further south in Nubia, is documented with genuine specificity in the Amarna letters, a cache of diplomatic correspondence on clay tablets exchanged between Egypt's royal court and foreign rulers during the 14th century BCE, and discovered at Amarna in 1887. In one frequently cited letter, the Mitanni king Tushratta wrote to Pharaoh Amenhotep III requesting a substantial gold shipment, remarking that in Egypt, gold was reportedly as plentiful as dust, a specific foreign perception of Egyptian wealth, preserved directly in a foreign ruler's own words, rather than in any Egyptian source boasting about itself. Despite gold's clear centrality to Egypt's international diplomatic standing and its extensive use throughout royal burial goods, the precise total scale of ancient Egyptian gold production, and exactly how many of the mining sites referenced in ancient texts and tomb paintings have been definitively located and excavated by modern archaeologists remains only partially resolved, since many suspected mining locations in the remote eastern desert remain difficult to access and have not yet received full modern archaeological survey. We've moved tonight through 10 chapters and 250 facts about a civilization that had already been ancient for longer than the gap separating it from us, from the Great Pyramid's still debated construction method, through the Sphinx's disputed age and vanished nose, into the genuinely sophisticated chemistry ancient embalmers worked out through what must have been centuries of careful trial and error, past a labyrinth larger than any pyramid that has essentially disappeared from the physical record, through a decipherment that opened Egyptian writing to the modern world while still leaving entire scripts and archives only partially read, into a tomb whose discovery reshaped popular imagination, while its own central mysteries remain unresolved, past the oldest religious texts on earth and the queens whose faces we know while their bodies remain lost, and finally out along trade routes stretching farther than the Egyptians themselves ever fully documented. What's worth sitting with in these last unhurried minutes is how much of tonight's material comes not from any shortage of Egyptian evidence, but from an actual abundance of it, genuinely enormous quantities of inscriptions, papyri, tombs, and artifacts that modern Egyptology has been carefully excavating, cataloging, and translating for less than 2 full centuries, a genuinely short span of organized scientific study, set against more than 3,000 years of continuous Egyptian civilization it's attempting to fully account for. Champollion's breakthrough decipherment happened only in 1822. Tutankhamun's tomb was found only in 1922. The Great Pyramid's hidden void was only confirmed in 2017. Measured against Egypt's own 3,000-year span, modern Egyptology itself is still, in a genuinely real sense, only just getting started. Some of tonight's specific open questions, the exact nature of the Great Pyramid's internal voids, whatever may or may not lie behind Tutankhamun's tomb walls, the precise original location of Punt, will likely find clearer answers within the coming decades, as non-invasive scanning technology, DNA analysis, and simple continued patient excavation keep steadily advancing. Others, particularly the full contents of Egypt's own vast, still only partially translated archive of everyday administrative writing, may take considerably longer, not because the underlying evidence is unclear, but simply because reading several thousand years of a civilization's accumulated paperwork, one papyrus fragment at a time, was never going to be fast work for any single generation of scholars to finish. There's something worth carrying with you specifically from a civilization built as thoroughly around the afterlife as ancient Egypt's was, since the Egyptians themselves, across 3,000 years of careful ritual, elaborate tomb building, and painstaking preservation, were never actually trying to defeat death outright or fully explain away its mystery. They were trying, instead, to prepare for it calmly, to leave behind enough care and craftsmanship that whatever came next could be met without panic. The heart weighed, the names spoken, the body kept whole enough to matter. Whatever you personally believe about what any of that ritual actually accomplished, the underlying instinct, meeting an unanswerable question with patience rather than fear, translates across 3,000 years. surprisingly well, right down into tonight's own quiet, unhurried version of the same basic idea.